All right, Neil, welcome back. A week on the hard seas, I guess you could say. Disney cruise with the family plus others. I thought your report yesterday was great, talking about consensus being offsides on growth again. And then maybe more importantly, people talking a lot about inflation right now. I just wanted you to square it all up for me.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the consensus, frankly, is too conservative for this year in terms of economic growth. I mean, if you look at, Blue Chip or Bloomberg, the fourth quarter over fourth quarter number is, barely 1.5% for this year. So, in other words, if consumer spending is growing about 2 and everything else is 0, and remember, consumer spending is about 70% of the economy. That's the consensus. So that's a very, very conservative expectation around growth. I do think business investment, particularly around equipment, is going to be a notable bright spot this year. There is an accelerator effect, right? So as companies think growth is going to pick up and recession expectations come down, they'll have a tendency of investing more. So it's more about what's going on with current demand. That's what companies tend to respond to. So that supports investment. Now, I do think the consensus is coming around to it. I still think they're too low, but they're moving in the right direction. So consensus has kind of been moving up over the last couple of months. That makes sense. Still too weak, but I think what the consensus has lost sight of is that the underlying story for inflation is still one of lower, not higher. There's a lot of talk about inflation reemerging. We're seeing that littered across the financial press. Just this morning, there was an article about, hotel room rates potentially perking back up. But for me, it's important to kind of stick with first principles here. We know that the labor market impulse for inflation isn't as strong as it was, right? So if you look at compensation growth from the ECI number as an example, that's up 3.5% in the last quarter. We know that quits are down. So I think, compensation growth is running about 3.5% and productivity is running about 1.5%. So you're basically talking about a 2% inflation environment. And, there's also still a pipeline of disinflation that's at least through the spring from used cars. We also know that with motor vehicle assemblies picking back up and demand for electric vehicles coming down, it's likely that new car prices are going to moderate as well. So there's still some disinflation from cars. And of course, the big one is shelter. We had a very fluky month in January with owner's equivalent rent rising, but rent of primary residence going down. And, that kind of gap really can't persist. I mean, by the nature of those two metrics, they kind of have to go in the same direction. So, my sense is that the underlying inflation story is still moderating. I think, for reasons like maybe residual seasonality, what's gone on with growth, people have kind of lost sight of that. And I think for the Fed, certainly the March rate cut is not happening. That's kind of we were off on that, kind of jumped the gun a little, but it doesn't mean that the overall story is really changing. At the end of the day, we're still talking about how much the economy is growing and when is the Fed cutting. And, my sense is that there's a high bar, frankly, for them not to cut this year. And, I think the May probabilities right now are around 15%. I wouldn't be surprised to see in March and April, those start to pick up a little bit because if residual seasonality is an important driver of why the January numbers were firmer, we're going to start to see evidence that, of that kind of unwinding as we head into the spring. So that could be a reason why inflation cools. And of course, we're going to be in the thick of it with respect to the cooling off of shelter prices. So again, the growth numbers mean that the Fed can't ease aggressively, but the inflation numbers mean they can recalibrate policy. And that's what we've been thinking the entire time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. I think we're out of time here, but thanks for the recap. Welcome back. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Eric.